Welcome back to another episode of Neuroscience Digest powered by my BrainWise coach. I am Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And Phil, we're so glad that you're back with us because you weren't feeling so well. So glad to see that you're back on your feet and back in what you called the land of the living this morning. And I thought one of the things we could do on our episode today is talk about our last episode. So the last episode of the Digest, I did a very brief discussion solo, so it wasn't nearly as good as the ones we have as a compadre or a two-person conversation. And I thought it would be interesting to take 10 minutes or whatever it is to just give your perspective on that discussion. So to give you just a bit of context and background, and then I'll ask you a couple of questions, I talked about the neuroscience of job searching and what I described to our BrainWise friends, because a lot of us are probably in this particular setting in terms of what is my next job? Where am I going to land in my next career? Because there is so much happening in the marketplace right now with layoffs and such. But what I described it as is really a ping pong effect going between the reward system and then the threat system, because we're threatened in the case that I don't know what I am from a protection perspective, financial obligations, all of those things. I also, from a participation perspective, I'm not in the work mode at that time, and I'm trying to create connections with others. And then, of course, there is the prediction, which I think is what's really activated in a lot of spaces here, is what's next? Do I have certainty, but really I don't? It's uncertainty. And so all of that's happening when we're applying for jobs. Then we're being told no. We get a lot more no's than we do yeses in the experience. But then we get a yes, and someone will say, oh, I want to interview you. So then the reward part of the circuitry of our brain is activated and we're excited about it. But then we go into after that interview, did I say the right thing? Did I do the right thing? Did I send the email at the right time to thank them? All of these things happen to us. And then we're back in a threat state because we're uncertain and we're waiting between the time of that last touch point to the next touch point, what's happened. And I even mentioned that oftentimes the waiting and the uncertainty is worse than the actual yes or no, quite honestly. And then we get the next one. So it's this like ping pong effect. So I just want to get your take on what I've shared with our BrainWise friends. What would you add? What would you counter? What would you support in that dialogue? And then how would you help our BrainWise friends who might find themselves in that position?
So first of all, great summary of what's going on. Lots of those things, absolutely. I'll add a couple of others. One is, you mentioned the fact that you have the interview and then afterwards you go, oh, did I do the right thing? And this, that, and the other. That is part of the brain. We call it the default network. We tend to go into rumination about the future or the past. But in that case, ruminating about things that, as I've often said, give up hope for a better yesterday. You did the interview. If there's anything that you look back and go, oh, when people ask that question, I could come up with a better answer, then write it down. There's nothing quite like writing this stuff down in your journal to make certain, and over several interviews, you can go, oh, do I see any patterns here? And those are the patterns you might want to start correcting. One of the things that if you have a job search, right, before you actually start the search, what are all the attributes of your next role or a continuous role or whatever it may be? What are the attributes you want, regardless of the job itself? And I know some of the things for you is I'm willing to do some travel, but not where it might impact my relationship. There's a certain financial obligation I have, and therefore I have a mental model about what that job is going to be worth to me. So you can identify all of those things in advance. And if you can do those in advance when you're not faced with an emotional choice, then it's a lot easier. Again, write the stuff down. Write down if you've got a dozen points that we were talking about, if you've got a dozen points about where you are, get them written down so that in one sheet, you've got exactly when somebody says, so tell me about yourself, then you're not going blah, 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 blah. It's actually got some organization to it. And we talked about that in terms of networking. What are the 5-minute description about where you are and what you want next? Those type of things can help. But that sort of back and forth between prediction and uncertainty, your brain lies, that sort of feeling of being protected and not protected, the feeling of being threatened and rewarded, all of those things are that, as you call it, the ping pong effect that is going on in the brain. If you can recognize it, yeah, that's just my brain. It's not me, it's my brain working on this. And therefore, take a third-party view of it and maybe get some little humor. Find the way of capturing that beautiful moment that we talked about, so that if you find yourself getting threatened, you can bring that image or picture or whatever is back into your mind. So all the things we've talked about, this is a sort of the pointy application of them.
And I think it's remembering this isn't, and this probably goes back to your conversation on the default mode network, which is none of this is a reflection of what you can bring to the table, right? In terms of who you are as a person and the skills and attributes that you have. The marketplace is competitive right now. It is an employer's market, not an employee's market when it comes to applying for jobs. And sometimes they can go through the applicant tracking system and never even see their resume, never really sees a physical person, right? But those no's are really difficult. And so to the degree you can, without missing those next step question or opportunities, have all of those emails go to a separate space. Or once you see it, don't read it because you know what it looks like. They're all formatted the same. Thank you so much for your application. And after further consideration, don't even read any further. Just move it over to the archives and go along with your day. So that way you can focus on what it is that you're actually working on, which is the ability to present yourself in a way to others that ultimately they'll want to jump on. And I think the other thing that I didn't talk about, but that just struck me, Phil, as you were describing it, is remember that for the interviewer, they also have a brain, right? Which means all of the things that we are experiencing from a threat and reward system bias perspective or whatever it is that's happening, mental models, they're experiencing you through that same lens, right? And so hopefully great interviewers are recognizing it and removing personal experience from the actual data that's being presented. And so I think recognizing that creates a bit of perspective and also maybe a bit of empathy in the situation, recognizing, okay, they also are experiencing these same things. So maybe it's not me. Maybe it's something that they experienced that I triggered off for them. That can be very possible in conversation, depending on how it goes.
Yeah. And one of the things we do know is that we establish in-groups, and we establish in-groups very quickly. So one of the things, again, I believe we talked about this, that is when we meet a stranger, the default circuitry in the brain is that that person is a foe. He calls me danger. So in order to get to the point where it moves over into a different set of circuitry, you want to find something in common with that person. Even though you may be the interviewee, it behooves you to actually see whether you can find something in common, right?
Absolutely.
For example, I'll lean to one side here and show the guy that's over here. We had somebody who made reference to it in some of our feedback, right? Hey, I now know that person knows what that's about. We just formed a little mini in-group. Both of the work of phrenology and Fowler. So we've got now a little in-group. So if that person ever comes into my perspective again, I'm actually going to deal with them as though they're now a friend. And it doesn't take a lot. It takes, on average, about a minute and a half to form an in-group. So if you can find out something you got in common with the interviewer, then you've got a much greater chance of actually having a better interview.
We won't be able to cover this in full detail probably, but they say do that on the front end of an interview because it's called the halo effect. I just learned about this recently, and there's the opposite of it, which is the horn effect, which will leave you to deduce what that means. But the halo effect is you've made some kind of connection or you said something so impressive on the first 30 seconds to 60 seconds of the interview that now everything else in that interview is going to be seen as the halo effect. Perfect. This person did all these great things. Now, to the degree that happens all the time, I'm sure it happens in some cases, and it's great to make those connections on the front end. But hopefully the interviewers are experienced and they recognize some of those things, but then it's good for the interviewee to know. And then on the opposite is also true. The horn effect, if you say something on the front end within the first 60 seconds to 120 seconds that is in opposition or that is questionable or whatever, then the interviewer tends to look at the rest of your conversation through a lens that is not objective in nature. And they actually teach this in interviewing to recruiters. What is the halo effect? What is the horn effect? So that as you're going through interviews, you're able to bifurcate it and look at objectively what is the data and the stories that these people are telling me in the interviews versus what might be happening for me, which horn effect, halo effect really is just different parts of neuroscience boiled into terminology that others can use.
And talking about what we were talking about earlier on about the use of metaphors, horn effect and halo effect are perfect two examples of metaphors that we use as a way of.
Absolutely.
I've never seen you actually with a halo on top of your head.
Maybe I'll get one.
There we go.
A halo held up by two horns, possibly.
I'll plead the Fifth Amendment on that one.
I'm sure depending on what part of the day, how tired I am, hungry I am, what's happening, my husband or my mom or others will probably say that my horns are showing under my halo. So,
yeah, about what my parents used to say, your halo's slipped, it's strangling you.
That's a good one too. I like that one. Thank you, Phil, for sharing your perspective on this topic. I think it's very apropos given the current climate of the job marketplace right now for others. And hopefully this additional context helped our BrainWise friends further understand what's happening in their mind if they are searching for their next career, or if they know someone who's searching for the next career, or if you are an interviewer, meaning a recruiter or hiring manager, how can you approach those discussions and those interviews and those interviewees with empathy? So with that, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay brainwise.